The opening vistas of space promise high costs and hardships, as well as high reward. So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. But this city of Houston, this state of Texas, this country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them.
April 1970. After the defeat of the Soviet Union in the space race and 2 successful missions to the moon, the United States prepared to launch Apollo 13, its 3rd attempt at a lunar landing. It was considered routine by the public, who had lost its focus on the space race and turned its attention toward the Vietnam War and the growing distrust of the American government. All that changed when, during the expedition, an explosion occurred on board the spaceship, preventing it from landing on the moon and turning the mission into a rescue. The crew's triumphant return to Earth demonstrated the superb capabilities of the NASA team and of the Apollo system. Apollo 13 was commanded by James Lovell. Accompanying him were Lunar Module pilot Fred Hayes and Command Module pilot Jack Swigert. Apollo 13 was launched on April 11, 1970. In order for the mission to be a success, all systems had to work perfectly. However, no one was aware that just 10 feet below the astronauts, the wiring inside Oxygen Tank 2 was cracked. The launch went smoothly, and the astronauts were on a path that would take them to the moon. In 3.5 days, Apollo 13 would be ready to land on the surface of the moon to collect rock samples and search for signs of volcanic activity. On April 13th, 56 hours into the flight and 4/5 the way to the moon, the mission control team and its flight controller, Gene Kranz, were scheduled to go off shift, but before doing so, they requested a cryostor which used fans to stir the liquid oxygen tanks.
I was seated at this console here in mission control, and the flight director, the noise level of this room was building up because the next team of controllers had reported in for shift handover. Their flight director, who was Glenn Lunny, a leader of the black team and who used colors to identify teams in those days, sitting next to me at the console reading my log. The final thing that my team had to do is to put the crew to sleep. We have a 5-page pre-sleep checklist we go through very carefully to make sure everything's properly configured before we give the go for the sleep. And we were down to the final entry. And this final entry asks a question: do we require a cryostor?
Dane, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tanks. In addition, I have a shaft and trunnion. Okay. For a look at the Comet Bennett if you need it.
Stand by. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
Can say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
A main bus B undervolt, a power failure. No one knew that the faulty wiring in the oxygen tank caused an explosion crippling the spacecraft. The primary thoughts of the astronauts and ground crew were of instrumentation failure, and neither realized how serious the problem was going to be. After glancing out one of the spacecraft's windows, Commander Lovell began to realize the seriousness of the problem they were encountering. Pure oxygen was venting into space.
And it looks to me, looking out the hatch, that we are venting something. We are venting something out into space.
Roger, we copy your venting.
With the command module losing oxygen and its power sources failing, a landing on the moon was out of the question. The ground crew realized that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to get the astronauts back home. If they were going to be rescued, it would take the entire mission control team's collaborative efforts to bring them back. The crew immediately began to power up the lunar lander to act as a lifeboat, but without a heat shield or parachutes, it alone would not be able to bring them home. They then realized that the command module must be shut down in order to preserve its batteries for re-entry.
To complete the electrical power picture in the command module, the fuel cells provide big base power for the ship. We have some additional batteries which were small. They were sized to do entry only.
News of the crippled spacecraft quickly circled the globe. Many countries from all over the world offered any assistance needed to help the United States recover the astronauts. Even the Soviet Union, in the midst of the Cold War, offered to aid America in this dire situation. After the shutdown of the command module, Flight Director Glenn Looney informed the crew it was essential an engine burn be performed. Without this critical burn at this time, the spacecraft would swing around the moon, miss the Earth, and remain in space forever. However, if the burn lasted too long, the spacecraft would crash into the moon. With the command and service modules offline, James Lovell and Fred Hayes had to use the lunar module to proceed with the burn. The ground crew would not know if the procedure had been successful until after the crew returned from the other side of the moon and back into radio contact.
We did a small burn, which put us back on a free return trajectory, and that accomplished a number of things. It demonstrated to us that the lunar module worked, the propulsion systems worked, the guidance system works. We had a good reference transferred over to the guidance system, and all that part of it was good. It also was a psychological boost to everybody involved because we knew we were not on a free return, and now we were at least close. We were close to a free return trajectory.
The burn worked flawlessly, and the spacecraft was now on a direct course for Earth. Back at Mission Control, the ground crew pulled together to try and limit the usage of power, water, and consumables so that they would be able to last the rest of the mission. In the lunar module, the crew also turned off lights and heat to conserve energy. As Apollo 13 got closer and closer to Earth, Mission Control was going to be faced with the task of turning the command module back on for re-entry. Only a mere 2 hours of power remained, requiring it to be turned on at the last possible moment. Along with powering up the command module, the astronauts had to move from the lunar lander to the command module, close the hatches, and separate the lunar and service modules from the capsule, all before re-entry into Earth's atmosphere.
And the basic problem is this. I have 3 spacecrafts up there. I have the lunar module, which is our lifeboat. I have the command module, which is our re-entry vessel. It has the only heat shield, but it has about 2 hours lifetime. And then I have the service module where the explosion occurred. And at the very last moment, as I'm getting ready to enter into the Earth's atmosphere, about 50 minutes from landing, I have to maneuver into an orientation so I can explosively separate these 3 parts in different trajectories. But before I do that, I have to evacuate from the lunar module, get into the command module, rapidly and efficiently power it up, initialize computer, close hatches, and then start blowing the pieces apart. As I said, this will turn into a checklist that's about 500 items long.
With the command module back online, the crew then separated the service modules to begin re-entry. At this point, they discovered the extent of the damage that had happened from the explosion.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. Right by the high gate antenna, the whole panel is blown out, almost from the base to the engine.
Everybody now realized how close the explosion was to the heat shield. Even the slightest crack would have caused Apollo 13 to disintegrate in the atmosphere, killing all 3 astronauts. The only question that remained was, would it all work? Mission Control wouldn't know until after blackout had ended.
Blackout is the time period where the fire of entry prevents communications to the spacecraft. At this stage in the program, we could compute when it would start and when it would finish to within a second, and we've never missed. And blackout is a very lonely time for every controller in this room because there's only one thought in everybody's mind. Did I give the crew everything I needed to? And was my data right? Because from now on, there are no more givebacks. The crew's on their own.
As the main parachutes opened, Mission Control erupted in both applause and tears. The work of hundreds of engineers and flight controllers had come to a remarkable end. The astronauts were home. As the Space Shuttle and Skylab programs began to develop, the Apollo program ended with Apollo 17 in 1972. The program itself stimulated many areas of technology. Its flight computer design was the driving force behind early research into integrated circuits, making today's electronics possible. The Apollo system also had been the building block of future spacecraft designs that will take us to Mars and beyond. The triumph of Apollo 13 was Mission Control's finest hour. Although the moon mission of Apollo 13 failed, the tragic deaths of 3 astronauts was averted. Critics of the risks and the financial costs of manned spaceflight were overwhelmed nearly everywhere by enthusiastic and positive reactions to the courage of the Apollo 13 crew and the superb performance of the ground personnel. Apollo 13 was indeed a successful failure.